This is Mike at Silicon Valley Global News, and I'm here with Brandon Jones. He works on WebVR at Google. Brandon, tell me about the current state of WebVR.
All right, so the current state of WebVR is that it's not a thing anymore and we're not working on it. And
I'm sorry, I actually know this. It's WebXR now.
yes, I'm teasing. I mean, it's a natural thing for people to have them confused. We do have two distinct specs that we think about at this point. WebVR, which is kind of the thing that's available on, like, say, the Oculus Go and a few other platforms. But we do consider it kind of a deprecated spec. And then we have WebXR, which is what we're currently working on, that should effectively be a superset of the functionality of WebVR plus AR capabilities. And that's going to eventually completely supplant WebVR as we know it, but be the standard that we hope to be on by default going forward. However, it's not all that inaccurate to just say, like, what's the state of WebVR, because people want to know, like, what can I do with VR on the web, and the XR designation is more of a technicality.
So I've seen some software recently, such as the Eighth Wall, where they're trying to, like, and there's also this other one called it just came out. It's got all these really neat colors. It's on the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift and Super Medium. These are both examples of, like, there's lots more like this where they're trying to make some sort of game engine that ties into WebVR. I'm not sure. I think I lost my question a little bit, but oh yeah, okay. So I started a project with a bunch of developers where we started using A-Frame because they have some sample code and it was really easy to start. I keep going back to the GitHub for WebXR and wondering how I'm going to make the transition there, because I don't really. I've been studying the GitHub. I'm like, where's the sample code and the thing?
So we do have some sample code for it right now, but honestly, like, because it's still a work in progress spec, there's aspects of it that are going to be shifting out from underneath it right now. So it is kind of hard to give a wholehearted recommendation to go out and try converting that code right now. We've asked for some people to give it a try, simply so that we have a decent idea of what's working for developers and what's not. And we have gotten some pretty good feedback from various developers saying, hey, this part's really confusing, or I don't understand why I need to go through this setup step and whatnot. But yeah, for people who are looking at using something like A-Frame, or a similar abstraction on top of it, which makes the content much easier to build. The WebXR and WebVR specs are fairly low level in terms of how you interact with them. Certainly if you look at the rest of the web, it's like, this is getting down to the nitty-gritty. And so the average developer who just wants to throw up something and have it work is probably better off just, like, playing around with A-Frame for the time being, even though it is built on technically the older API. And then the expectation is that once we get WebXR to the point that it is really fully available, the people behind A-Frame will be able to do, my hope is, an almost entirely behind-the-scenes conversion, so that you as the developer kind of just don't have to care. And the hope is that the most that they'll have to do is maybe add in some additional properties to say, oh, hey, I want this exposed to AR now instead of just VR, and those kind of things.
So with WebXR and WebVR, what Google has, and Google and all the other companies have helped accomplish is focusing basically on establishing the fundamentals, really basic things, but also bringing it up to where you're able to do like 90 frames per second on the Vive or the Rift, and of course match the frame rates on the mobile headsets. I keep losing my train of thought. But anyway, so I'm kind of like thinking, okay, so what are some of the next big steps? Because people, we're seeing, like, okay, so one example. and it's silly for me to bring this up, but when do you think we'll see, like, high definition render pipeline or ray tracing, or real-time ray tracing? When can we have that? I mean, that's going to be maybe could be we're talking years, but
so I'll talk about an effort that I'm not as directly involved in, but there are efforts underway right now to create a, I wouldn't necessarily even call it a successor, but maybe like a complementary API to WebGL, or an alternative to WebGL, that is currently going under the name WebGPU. And this is basically a API that is attempting to model itself much more after Vulkan, DirectX 12, and Metal, the much more modern APIs that have lower overhead and allow you to pull off nicer tricks. No API is ever going to overcome the limitations of a mobile GPU. If you're just not going to be able to do some of the things that you can on desktop. But hopefully, with some of the efforts that are underway, we can get much closer to the state of the art on the native side in both mobile and desktop capabilities. As for something like ray tracing, this is still a very very new technology, even on the native side, and the tendency of the web is to not jump into something that's that new before it's really had a chance to prove itself. And so while you might see some experimentation, and probably the best bet is that you might see some extensions to WebGPU whenever that comes out that would allow you to hook into some of these ray tracing constructs. I think that's something that we're going to have to wait for the native ecosystem to show us how it's going to play out a little bit better, because right now, in terms of real-time ray tracing anyways, it is primarily NVIDIA that's pushing forward their new tech. It looks really cool. It's not something that I personally had a chance to play around with, so I can't comment too much on the technical issues behind it, but it's one of those things that maybe it'll work out really well and maybe it won't. We've seen that repeatedly over the years with GPU features like, geometry shaders, it's the next big thing, and well, maybe never mind. And tessellation shaders, it's the next big thing. Well, that worked out better, but it's still not something that gets used everywhere. And we go back and forth, but then you get compute shaders, and hey, actually that had a huge effect on how we interact with the GPU. And maybe this is a compute shader, maybe this is a geometry shader. I don't know.
There was this WebAssembly was this idea that you could sort of render websites using the performance of your phone or your computer, right? But you could also
right. So WebAssembly is a technology for taking code that is traditionally compiled into a more native format. Your typical C++ and stuff like that. It's not restricted to a single language. It's just whatever can produce the byte code. And feeding it into the browser in such a way that the browser has to do less processing on the code overall, less run just-in-time compiling and whatnot, and can also have stronger guarantees about the performance characteristics of that. So you're not doing some of the runtime checks that JavaScript has to do, and as a result, it can get much closer to full native speed than JavaScript is sometimes able to. And I've heard various numbers getting kicked around. I think in some cases it gets half of native speed. In some cases it gets 80% of native speed. And I think it just has room to grow. But it's worth noting that technology in and of itself actually has nothing to do with actually producing imagery to go on a web page. It's just executing code. And then that code can be through a series of trampolining out into regular JavaScript or whatnot. It can execute WebGL, which is a very popular method for interacting with WebAssembly, for allowing games to be ported and whatnot. That's what Unity does. It can also just interact with the DOM directly. It's a little roundabout way to do that, but it certainly can do so. Or in some cases, you might just say, hey, I really need a zip library, or a compression library, zip library is the same thing, or an encryption library or something like that, and they only really exist in native code. This is a way to compile that into an artifact that can be consumed by the web and executed on that platform without porting the whole thing over to JavaScript. And so it may have no visual effect at all. It just is accomplishing some processing behind the scenes.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about two questions. One is about connecting your Unity app to WebVR and what the promise of that is, so that you don't have to like completely rewrite it in HTML.
So speaking about Unity to WebVR or WebXR specifically, that's something that I personally feel is going to be a little ways off. And it's because while we're seeing an environment now where people are trying to cross-compile Unity games into the web, a lot of that is to be able to take simpler Unity titles. It's usually not the big AAA games or anything like that, but make them accessible to Facebook or other platforms like that. And that's a really good starting point, because you can get into this mode where you have these pieces of content that maybe are a little bit harder sell to do through the store. It's like, do I really want to go and download another Candy Crush clone to my phone, even though like this one has a particular theme that I might like or something like that. But if you can just kind of make it available through Facebook, through like their Instant App platform or whatever they call it, then that can be attractive to other users in a variety of situations. You might also get things like ads that can take advantage of Unity and do that cross-compile, but it's going to be not the same scope of experiences as you might expect from native Unity apps right now.
How about that Nintendo 64 emulator that showed up?
The N64 emulator. I think that's fantastic. Like, I loved reading through that blog post, and I think he did one for PlayStation as well.
Did you get to try it?
I haven't actually tried them. I've just haven't had the time. I've been super busy between work and family. I really should sit down and play with it at some point, but I love the technical details in the blog that he posted, and especially the insight. Just for me, I never really knew too much about how the N64, the PlayStation worked, and they're just not at all like what we tend to think of in terms of modern GPUs and like how you handle triangles and stuff like that. So those were fascinating details to read to me. And then the way that he presented the content was fascinating in and of itself. And on top of all of that, the fact that it was built on web technologies using WebGL, WebAssembly, WebVR, that's just fantastic. I love that idea. I love that the web is an environment that can foster that kind of experimentation, where it's like, it's a crazy idea, and the nature of emulators is always a little legally perilous, and so like getting them on stores maybe doesn't always pan out. It might be something that's completely reasonable to run on an iOS device, but Apple may not approve of that on their store and that kind of thing. But the web's like, sure, yeah, throw that up on here and make it a fun experiment to all, and there's just a different attitude about just trying weird stuff on the web, and that's an amazing thing. And it's always been, for me, one of the primary goals of investing in these web technologies like WebGL and like WebVR is just to give people a place to play with ideas that they may not be commercially viable, they may be, they may be very small in scope, they may just be artistic and weird and like all these different things that have a hard time fitting into the ecosystems that we've built up around these devices, which are very commercial for good reason. Like, they have to fund themselves. We have to show developers that they can actually make money off of it. But to have like that opening where you can say, and this is where all the weird stuff goes, I think it's fantastic, and that's always been a goal of mine.
So I wanted to ask, because you kind of, because you're at the core of WebXR and before that WebVR, you have, I think, like compared to most folks, you have that 50,000 foot view of seeing all the companies and all the community of companies and what different people are creating. And so what are some of the things, we talked about some of the things that are exciting, but what else are you seeing that other people may not know about that's really good for what's coming in WebXR in the next year and a half?
So from the spec side, we've just recently, in like the last 3 days or so, formalized the creation of a working group. And that's just one big significant step along the way to actually creating a specification that becomes a candidate recommendation that goes through all those administrative steps to actually becoming a real spec. And so that's an important step in the right direction. We are currently also refactoring some of the spec to make sure that it can really account for the current state of AR, which honestly mostly means like phone AR at this point, but also, with a nod towards the HoloLenses and Magic Leaps of the world, that it can kind of take into account the current state of that, and we can actually have people produce content for those platforms, because phone AR especially, it's not immersive in the same way that we think of the rest of like the immersive computing environment, but it is a platform that has a lot of eyeballs right now, and it has a lot of compatible hardware right now. So many people have a phone that can run this kind of thing. And so if we can capitalize on that and use it as kind of like a gateway drug to get people thinking about how you produce immersive content, what the tool chain looks like, how you actually navigate and interact with that and everything else, then as we get more immersive forms of that platform, the content hopefully will just already be there for it and can just up-convert. So that's what we're doing with the spec right now, so making sure that we're accounting for that. And then in terms of content, it's kind of anyone's guess. Like, there's some really interesting, really good content out there for WebVR. My favorites at the moment, and have been for a little while, are Matterport. Does some very interesting stuff with real estate. It's actually one of the sites that we see our metrics saying that people are the most engaged in, which is fantastic. There's also sites like Sketchfab, where they've made their entire model library available to VR through WebVR, and that's a fantastic thing to work in. Yeah, just talking about, so Sketchfab is an interesting one to note, because both Matterport and Sketchfab have native apps. It's worth noting this. And yet they've both chosen to also make their content accessible via the web. And I think that it speaks to the way that they expect consumers to actually interact with that content, where, Sketchfab especially, they have this massive library, like huge library, probably one of the biggest ones online of all these different 3D models. And when you look at their native apps, they're usually like a highlights reel. They're the best of. And that's interesting, because what they're trying to do in that case is play to the expectations of the platform that they're releasing the native app on, and saying, well, we know that this is on a Gear VR or on an Oculus Go or on a Rift or whatever, and so therefore we're going to pick the content that shows it well on there. It's going to be low poly stuff, it's going to be whatever. Whereas on the web, they're just like, it's all there. Yes, some of these models have like 10 million polygons, and if you try to load it up on your cardboard, you're going to die. Your phone is just going to keel over and croak. Not literally, like we prevent that, but and there's a bit of a user beware sensibility to it that's like, yeah, we're going to make this available. We're not going to just stop you from getting to this. And maybe it's a bad experience, but the key is that nobody decided what piece of content was worthwhile for you. And that's a theme that we see all throughout the web. And because there's no quality bar to pass, you're going to get some really bad content on there, and you're going to get content that you're trying to run in an environment that it just never was meant to run in. But then you'll also get content that you simply could not find any other place, either because it didn't meet somebody's quality bar, but you still find it interesting, The content itself doesn't meet whatever community guidelines or store guidelines they have. It's politically charged. It's all these different things, and so I'm hoping to see a lot more of that, where you'll have companies that, if they're not comfortable doing something on the native platforms because of making sure they can pass the gatekeepers, but they can still fall back on the web, even if they have a native alternative, to make sure that the full spectrum of their content is available.
So, I imagine, have you seen the new AR features on Niantic's Pokemon Go?
Yeah. Are you talking about like the occlusion technology, or?
Yeah, the occlusion technology, seeing your character is actually on a plane in a fixed space. The reason I'm bringing that up is that, like, I saw that and I was like, you know what? Location-based social networking games, that could be really big, and it really seems like it's important for WebXR to be tied into that, because social networks you want them to be on the web, obviously, because it's about connecting with other people, and so that seems like an exciting product direction, and maybe there's a bunch of folks who are thinking the same thing. But then the other sort of with the connected idea then is what that I wanted to ask you about. This is like a two-part question. The second part is, what are some of the sort of myths and fears around developers being able to make money, and what are some of the possible solutions for developers who may be working on, they've created some sort of social networking WebAR game like Pokemon Go. How would they be able to, what are the guidelines for making money, and what are the fears, and what's the reality?
Right. It's a really good question, and I don't know that I have a complete answer to it. It is something that comes up a lot lately, is people saying, how do I effectively monetize on the web? For not VR or anything like that, just in general. There are some concerted efforts by the browser makers to try and make monetization on the web platform look a little bit more like it does on mobile, because we hear from a lot of people that that's a good environment for them to be in, where they can put a button on their app and be pretty assured that when the user clicks that, there's actually a payment method behind it, and they'll do that micropayment or whatever. So there's the payment API that's recently come about on the web. It's not a perfect analog for some of the mobile payment stuff, but it starts trending in the right direction, where it makes it a lot easier for pages to do kind of a payment provider agnostic method of just putting a buy now button on your page. And of course, being the web, there's always been a long history of alternative monetization methods, and usually that means ads. But you can also think of it in terms of there's a lot of content that we see that is just driving people towards, like, here's a taste of something bigger, and you can go get our native app over here, or it is an outright ad. The content itself, it's not ad supported, but it's promoting something else. There's also people experiment around with different ways of having people do subscriptions to their content, and then use all the capabilities of the modern web to ensure that the content that they're producing is much more interesting. Not talking about WebVR, but if you look at like what the New York Times and stuff like that does a lot of recently, they go out and use WebGL to pack some of their online stories with really interesting visualizations of the landscape that they're talking about in a particular feature, or a building, or maps, or divisions of the country, stuff like that. And so taking content that is already otherwise monetized and using it to enhance that in a way that really draws people in, and maybe retains subscribers better, and then draws in new ones. Again, like, none of it is the perfect solution yet for I really just want a mobile style buy button on my page, but we are trending in that direction, and in the meantime there's a lot of interesting ways that you can approach having your content on the web and having it actually be not like a charitable donation to the community at large, basically.
So Google's Cloud Anchors is a really interesting product, and that really brings up creating multi-user experiences with WebXR. What can you tell me about the developments in that direction and how easy it's going to be? And the final point is about controllers. What's the current progress in bringing in all the advanced features of all the different kinds of controllers?
So for something like Cloud Anchors, it really is a very interesting API, and we are within the WebXR community group, the Immersive Web community group, and working group now. We're very interested in exploring the possibilities that those kind of APIs bring up. Another similar example is image recognition APIs, where everybody's seen the demos on Twitter where you pull out a business card and you get this like AR data overlay that sticks to it as they're moving around in space. These are really, really cool, and we definitely want to support them. In some cases, both of those are a good example of it. We run into the problem that the data that's required in order to support those features on the native level is very platform specific. So using the image recognition as an example, what that has you do currently for AR Core, and I can't really speak to AR Kit because I'm not as familiar with it, is you take your image and you submit it to a service, and it machine learnings it to death and spits out a nice little matrix that says, hey, feed this into our system, and it will do the convolutions to figure out when it can find that image in your environment. But that's something that only works for AR Core. And I think ARKit has a similar limitation where like the way that the data process is very specific to their system. We don't want to get into a scenario where the user or the developer of a web technology has to be cognizant of, oh, well, I have to have these 20 different versions of that image detection data point, otherwise it just doesn't work out. And so it's on our roadmap to explore how do we do that in a way that's actually web friendly, that doesn't rely on you to have deep knowledge of the underlying platform, and you can just say, no, really, I just want to have this image, and if I feed it in or something derived from it, then it works on all the platforms. Cloud Anchors are a similar case right now where there's all of the methods for describing a particular space tend to be proprietary right now. And at some point we will have to overcome that. And that's exactly the type of stuff that standards groups like ours are built to do. And I anticipate that that's going to be a little bit of an ugly battle. But what we might also see in the meantime is some novel solutions where you just take advantage of the fact that you're on the web, you have kind of an implicit connection out to the internet. For something like Cloud Anchors, the majority of the interesting information lives on a server somewhere. And we may end up just seeing supplemental services that somehow are able to go in and get the Cloud Anchor and then do their own set of basic detection against the AR feed and say, okay, I'm going to align these APIs independently without it being a natively supported thing. And then, at some point we may be able to take advantage of that and make it a natively supported thing for, faster downloads and faster processing and better, better support, and crib a lot from what the community has already done to support that. That's something that you historically see happen over and over and over again in the web, is somebody puts out proof of concepts that don't rely on necessarily any piece of native implementation, and then can say, this could get better in these specific ways if we did it in the browser itself, and that's what actually drives adoption of that feature.
The ability to run Android apps inside the Mirage Solo is something that is really making me rethink sort of recalculate what's going to be the dominant headset, because that's a pretty awesome feature. And then Google announced these new 6-off controllers that are very inexpensive because of a new deep learning technique that they applied. So what do you think is the roadmap for maybe being in a Mirage Solo with these 6-off controllers and being in a WebVR experience or a WebXR experience? What are you seeing in terms of in the Solo also has the pass-through cameras, so you can do the augmented reality stuff. What do you think on the topic of controllers, where that's going and whether that will be ready when those get launched?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of like the 6-off controllers and stuff like that, it's certainly my intent that any fidelity of input that you can do with any of the Daydream headsets, we will just expose up through Chrome. And WebVR and WebXR already do a pretty good job of being able to jump between 3-DoF and 6-DoF controllers, and so, like, realistically, hopefully in some future version of Chrome that's not too far out, you'll just, if you happen to have those controllers, then suddenly your controller motion will be more 6-DoF-y, and the actual API surface isn't going to really change all that much. Similarly for pass-through, like we are designing, like I said, APIs that make sure that we're taking advantage of phone AR, but with an eye also towards what's Magic Leap doing, what's HoloLens doing, how do we make sure the content can be tuned towards that. And when you start talking about the Mirage Solo pass-through, well, it starts to look a lot more like an analog to those headsets. And so this is something that I have not proven out at all, but I would definitely like to allow, at least in some experimental way, the ability to go in and say, hey, yeah, I'm gonna flip that flag on the Mirage Solo and now use it as, at the very least, a proxy for the more advanced AR-centric headsets, and be able to just prove out various concepts and make sure that your content looks good in that mode, and all these different things. And as for whether or not that will be like an officially supported mode or something that appears behind the flag, I don't really know, and that depends largely on decisions of teams other than myself. But my intention is always, if we have access to a piece of hardware and it has a certain capability, any way I can expose that to the web, I want to do so, especially if there's a reasonable path to doing so in a cross-platform way.
Great. Any thoughts and reflections on this event here at OC5? Anything you saw that you were excited about?
I'm super excited about Quest. Like, I just think that, like we were just talking about, like the Mirage Solo with the 6-DoF tracking and then the 6-DoF controllers and the pass-through and everything, really interesting in terms of like, a development environment for people to start playing around with some of these concepts. When Quest comes out, I think it's going to just, cement that category even more. I'm very excited for the day when 6-DoF is just an assumption, not a question that we have to ask. And yeah, I mean, I think that the price, Oculus is really, really good about nailing the price for consumer electronics. They did it beautifully with the Go, and I think that the price for the Quest is going to be good too. So I'm really excited about simply the exposure that will give to new consumers. Beyond that, I'm just like, this entire event has kind of lit a fire under me to just say, we really need to get our tech out there faster, and we need to make sure that it is just rock solid. And whenever you're talking about like refactoring work that you're doing, like I was talking about with the AR stuff, there's always a little bit of like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back feel to it. And it's easy to get a little discouraged, going, oh, I thought the finish line was here, but now it's out there. And coming to this and seeing how much enthusiasm there is around immersive computing as a whole, and just being in the room with so many amazing developers and so much amazing tech and everything, it really makes me just want to go home and just write the whole spec in one night. Like, let's just finish this thing and ship it tomorrow. Like, I'm pumped, let's go. And of course that's not realistic, but I think it's important just to have those moments of reigniting the fire within oneself and going, no, this is important stuff. And despite changing goals or stuff like that, it is something that we will accomplish, we must accomplish, and I'm looking forward to getting it out to everybody really soon.
Great, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.